She was nobody. That's what they told her. A quiet nurse in worn scrubs who kept her head down and asked for nothing. On the morning of the worst day of her life, Administrator Dale Voss grabbed her by the arm in the middle of the Harrowgate Medical Center cafeteria, in front of 200 people, and shoved her into a table hard enough to rattle the trays. "Dead weight," he said into the silence. "That's all you are." Every eye in the room landed on Nurse Mara Weston. They expected her to cry, to apologize, to disappear. Instead, she went completely still. Her pale gray eyes moved across the room in a slow, methodical sweep. Not scared, not angry, the way someone scans for threats when they've been trained to. One man in the back corner saw that look. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He'd seen eyes like that before. He'd seen them in Fallujah. If this story has you locked in from the first line, do me a favor. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this one goes places you won't expect. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The trouble with Harrowgate Medical Center was that it had been rotting from the top down for years, and everyone knew it, and nobody said a word. The hospital sat at the northern edge of Delmore, a mid-sized city in eastern Oregon that had boomed briefly during a tech expansion and then contracted, leaving behind a skyline that looked more optimistic than the economy underneath it. Harrowgate was the largest medical facility in the county, which meant it had a certain institutional arrogance baked in. There were 3 other hospitals within driving distance, but none of them had the trauma certification, the research funding, or the political connections that Harrowgate had accumulated over 2 decades under the same rotating cast of executives. Dale Voss had been chief operating officer for 6 years. He was the kind of administrator who wore expensive shoes to a hospital and expected staff to notice. He had a management philosophy he'd summarized once in a department meeting as accountability starts at the bottom, and he had never appeared to consider the implications of that statement. The nursing staff called him other things, mostly in break rooms and parking garages, mostly in whispers. Mara Weston had worked at Harrowgate for 14 months. She'd come quietly, with a sparse resume that listed a nursing certification from a state program, a gap year that simply read independent contractor, medical support, and 2 years of rural clinic work in northern Idaho. The hiring manager at the time had noted her calm demeanor and her ability to start the following Monday. That had been enough. What the resume didn't mention, what no document in her employee file mentioned, was the 6 years before the gap year. The deployment cycles, the field hospitals in places the news didn't cover, the specific incident in the Korengal Valley that had resulted in a commendation she'd never framed and a psychiatric clearance document she carried in the bottom of her bag because her therapist had suggested it might be useful someday. She kept to herself at Harrowgate. She was competent and quiet and showed up on time, and she had the kind of situational awareness that colleagues occasionally noticed without knowing what to call it. She always knew where the crash carts were. She repositioned them twice without being asked, and both times it turned out they'd been somewhere inconvenient. A senior physician named Dr. Calloway had thanked her once, confused but genuine. That had been one of the better days. The worst days involved Dale Voss. It had started small, the way these things do. A comment in the hallway about her documentation speed, a pointed remark in a staff meeting about nurses who exceeded their scope. The first time he'd addressed her by name, it had been to tell her, in front of 3 other staff members, that her suggestion during a process review meeting was not what we pay nurses to think about. She had nodded. She had moved on. The thing about Mara Weston was that she had made a deliberate decision, after she came home from her last deployment, to stop reacting fast. Speed had served her in the field. In a hospital hallway in Oregon, she'd learned, speed mostly made things worse. So she had built herself a habit of stillness, of absorbing the hit and measuring the response and choosing, every time, to say less than she could. It made people underestimate her. She knew that. She'd decided it was worth it. What she hadn't accounted for was that some people interpret stillness as weakness, and weakness as an invitation. Voss had escalated through the fall. By November, he was making a point of addressing her in shared spaces, cafeteria, nurses' station, the main corridor near the elevator bank, in ways that were technically professional and deliberately humiliating. He questioned her patient notes in front of residents. He once told a charge nurse that Mara's triage assessments should be cross-checked more thoroughly than most, and left it at that, which was a masterclass in damage by implication. None of it was enough to file formally. She knew that too. She had filed 2 informal concerns with HR, both of which had been reviewed by a coordinator who reported to Voss's direct superior, who played golf with Voss. The responses had been courteous and useless. On the morning of December 11th, Mara had been in the cafeteria at 7:15 a.m., on a break between the overnight and a double she'd agreed to cover. She was eating a bowl of oatmeal she didn't particularly want. The cafeteria was full. Shift change, morning rounds, the usual density of a hospital at peak intake hours. Voss had come in with 2 other administrators. Mara had clocked him at the door, noted the trajectory, returned to her oatmeal. He'd changed his path to walk directly toward her. What happened next lasted about 12 seconds. He grabbed her arm above the elbow. He pulled her sideways, hard enough that her hip caught the edge of the table and her tray slid. He leaned in close enough that she could smell his coffee. And he said, in a voice pitched perfectly to Carrie, "Dead weight, that's all you are. This place is for professionals, not someone who's just taking up space and waiting to make a mistake that costs someone their life." He let go and turned around. He said something to his colleagues that drew a quiet laugh. He walked away. The cafeteria was silent. Mara stood where she was. Her hip ached. Her coffee had spilled across the tray and was dripping onto the floor. She didn't look at the coffee. She looked at the room. Slowly, deliberately, the full sweep. And in the back corner, she saw a man named Terence Okafor, a facilities supervisor who'd been at Harrowgate for 11 years, standing completely motionless with a coffee cup frozen in his hand and an expression on his face she didn't recognize at first. It took her a second to place it. Not pity, not outrage, recognition. Okafor set down his cup carefully and walked out of the cafeteria without making eye contact with anyone. Quote, the formal suspension notice arrived at 9:47 a.m. Mara was in the middle of a wound assessment on a patient in room 412 when the charge nurse, Debbie Holtz, appeared in the doorway with a printed memo and the expression of someone delivering news they fundamentally did not want to deliver. "I need you to step out," Debbie said quietly. "I'm so sorry." The memo cited disruptive behavior, insubordination, and conduct inconsistent with Harrowgate Medical Center's standards of professionalism, effective immediately, pending review. At the bottom was Voss's signature. There was also a security officer in the hallway. Young guy, newer hire, visibly uncomfortable. He had been told to escort her out. He was doing the job he'd been given. Mara read the memo twice. She handed it back to Debbie. She finished writing her patient note. Every line complete, because the patient needed continuous care and whoever picked up the case needed full information. Then she gathered her bag and her jacket and said to Debbie, who was clearly fighting something complicated, "Make sure 412 gets his antibiotic redose at 11. It's due and it's easy to miss in a handoff." Mara, 11 o'clock. He's got an allergy flag on penicillin derivatives, so whoever takes over needs to confirm the substitution is documented. I put it in the notes, but flag it again anyway. Debbie nodded. Her eyes were bright. Mara walked out. The security officer kept pace beside her down the corridor, past the nurse's station toward the elevator. People watched. Some of them looked away quickly. A resident named Dr. Yuen watched her walk the entire length of the hallway with an expression Mara couldn't quite read, somewhere between guilt and something else. The elevator opened. Mara stepped in. The security officer stopped at the threshold, his role apparently ending there. In the last second before the doors closed, Terence Okafor appeared from the stairwell door 20 feet down the hall. He was walking quickly. He looked at her through the narrowing gap. He said, "I know who you are." The doors closed. The drive home took 20 minutes. Mara lived in a second-floor apartment in a building that had been converted from a cannery in the 90s, which gave it interesting bones and drafty windows and a radiator that made sounds she'd stopped noticing after the first winter. She sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine off. The smart thing, the thing her therapist would have approved of, was to go upstairs, make tea, and start documenting everything while it was fresh. File dates, direct quotes, names of witnesses present. Build the record. She'd been building it for 2 months. At this point, she had enough for a serious complaint, possibly enough for legal consultation. She'd been avoiding legal consultation because it meant escalating. And escalating meant the situation becoming the thing she was known for, and she had come to Delmore specifically to not be known for anything. She got out of the car. She made the tea. She opened her laptop and had typed 2 sentences when her phone rang. Unknown number, Oregon area code. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. Ms. Weston. The voice was male, older, professional without being warm. My name is Terrence Okafor. I work facilities at Harrowgate. I don't know if you remember me from... I remember you. A pause. I served 2 tours, Army, 2004 to 2010, Mosul and then Helmand. She waited. I've been at Harrowgate long enough to know what's happening there. I've watched Voss do versions of this to other people. But I've never... He stopped, started again. I've never seen someone look at a room the way you looked at it this morning, after what he did to you. I appreciate the call, she said carefully. I'm not calling to check on you, Okafor said. I'm calling because I pulled your file, not your personnel file. I don't have access to that. The public incident reports you filed with HR, both of them, and I've got 3 other staff members who've told me things in confidence that they're too scared to put in writing, and I want to know if you're going to fight this. The radiator knocked twice. Mara looked out the window at the late morning light on the building across the alley. I'm considering my options, she said. That's a very careful answer. It's the honest one. Another pause. I saw something this morning, Okafor said. Before he grabbed you. You saw him coming across that cafeteria and you didn't move. You didn't try to avoid it. You let him come. Mara was quiet. That's not how most people behave when they're scared, he said. That's how people behave when they're collecting evidence. She didn't confirm or deny that. What is it you want, Mr. Okafor? I want to not watch another competent person get pushed out of that building by someone who's never done a difficult thing in his life. A beat. And I want you to know that you're not alone in this, whatever you decide to do. She thanked him. She hung up. She sat with the phone on the table for a long moment, then went back to her documentation. But something had shifted, some small recalibration. She typed faster. Paul. She was on her 3rd page of notes when the alert came through the city emergency broadcast system at 1:22 p.m. She had her scanner app running, old habit, never fully broken, and the traffic was loud and specific, mass casualty event, Interstate 84, eastbound near the Sycamore Road exit. A commercial bus had gone off the overpass embankment. Preliminary report, 43 passengers, multiple ejections, fire on scene, EMS requesting all available trauma support and alerting area hospitals. Harrowgate was the designated Level 2 trauma center for the Eastern Delmore corridor. Mara was still in her apartment. She sat with that for about 30 seconds. She thought about the suspension letter. She thought about Voss's signature at the bottom. She thought about what 43 people on a bus meant in terms of resource load, and what Harrowgate's current staffing looked like on a Wednesday afternoon in December, and what she knew about the hospital's triage protocol, which she had read 3 times because she'd wanted to understand the gaps. She thought about room 412 and his 11 o'clock antibiotic. She picked up her jacket. The ER entrance of Harrowgate at 1:48 p.m. looked like a disaster simulation that had gotten out of hand. 4 ambulances were staged outside, 2 more inbound, and through the glass doors she could see the controlled chaos failure mode. People moving fast in wrong directions, voices overlapping, the particular visual noise of a system that had not been tested at this capacity in a long time. Mara walked through the main entrance, not the ER bay, the main doors where security was light and the attention was elsewhere. She clipped her badge. Technically, it was still valid. Suspensions at Harrowgate didn't trigger badge deactivation until HR processed the paperwork, which ran on a 24-hour cycle, and HR had not yet processed anything because HR was currently overwhelmed along with everyone else. She walked to the ER. What she saw in the first 10 seconds told her most of what she needed to know. There were 18 patients triaged in the corridor, 6 on gurneys, the rest on any available surface. At least 4 of them were in categories that were going to deteriorate without immediate prioritization. She identified a tension pneumothorax risk, a probable internal bleed being assessed by a resident who was going to miss it, a pediatric patient, a child, maybe 9, who was conscious but whose coloring was wrong in a way that wasn't showing up in the surface assessment. There were 3 attendings visible. They were each in the middle of something and could not be interrupted. The charge nurse on duty was a woman named Felicia Grant, whom Mara had worked with on 2 previous shifts and assessed as competent under normal load, but currently operating with the expression of someone who had reached the point where they were making lists to avoid the feeling of drowning. Mara went to Felicia. "I need you to listen to me for about 45 seconds, Mara said, and there was something in her voice, level, not loud, the specific cadence of someone who assumes they will be obeyed, that made Felicia stop and turn. The kid in Bay 7 is showing early signs of cardiac tamponade. She needs echo now, not in rotation. The man against the far wall, blue jacket, gray beard, is a probable splenic laceration. He's compensating, but his pressure will drop. He needs 2 large-bore IVs and a type and cross before he crashes, which is going to happen in the next 20 minutes if nobody moves him up. And your tension pneumo risk is Bay 3, the woman, not the man. She's the one who's guarding her breathing." Felicia stared at her. "You're suspended." "I know." "Voss is going to—" "I know," Mara said again, same voice. "Bay 7, the child. Can you get Dr. Calloway?" Felicia looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then she turned and started moving. Mara moved with her. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not clean or heroic in the cinematic sense. It was loud and cramped, and there were moments where things went wrong and had to be corrected under pressure. A supply cart wasn't where it was charted. A resident misread a blood type, and Mara caught it at the last second. She had to raise her voice twice, not to be aggressive, but because the noise level was high enough that direction given at normal volume was getting lost. She directed without commanding mostly. She positioned herself as the fix point, the person who held the overview while everyone else was heads down in individual cases, and she fed information to the right people in the right sequence without needing them to understand why she had it or how she'd assessed it. She knew what this looked like from the outside. She'd done it before, in a different kind of room, under different kinds of noise. Dr. Calloway found her at 2:20 p.m., between cases, in the corridor outside Bay 4. "Weston," he said. He was out of breath. "What are you doing here? I heard—" "Temporary resource gap," she said. "I'll be out of your way when it stabilizes." He looked at her. He was 61 years old, had been in medicine for 35 years, and had worked mass casualties twice before. He recognized something. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "Different context," she said. He nodded once, slowly, and went back to his patient. At 2:31 p.m., Dale Voss walked into the ER. He had his phone in his hand and his jaw set, and his eyes found her within 4 seconds. He started across the room in her direction with the specific energy of a man who had decided this was the moment everything got resolved in his favor. "Weston," his voice cut across the ambient noise. Several heads turned. "You are suspended. You have no authority to be in this building. You are in violation of your suspension terms, and I am calling security right now to have you physically—" "There's a child in Bay 7, Mara said. He stopped. "She coded 12 minutes ago," Mara continued, same level voice. "She's stable now. If Dr. Calloway hadn't gotten the echo when he did—" She let that sit for half a second. "The man in Bay 9 is currently in surgery for a splenic lac that would have been a fatality if intake hadn't been reprioritized. And you have 3 more patients in that corridor who are going to require intensive monitoring in the next 2 hours. Voss's mouth worked for a second. The room around them had gone quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone instinctively recognizes as significant. "I don't care," he said, and his voice came out less steady than he wanted. "You are out of compliance. You are a liability. I am removing you from this—" "Dale!" Dr. Calloway's voice came from behind them both. He was standing in the doorway of Bay 7, gloves still on, face mask around his neck. "I need you to walk away from this right now." Voss turned. "Excuse me?" "The child is stable because Weston told Felicia what to look for," Calloway said. I don't know what your problem is with her, and I honestly don't have time to care. But if you pull her out of this ER in the next hour, I am documenting that interference, and I am calling the chief medical officer personally." The silence stretched. Voss's jaw tightened. He looked at Mara with something that had moved past professional hostility into something uglier, more personal. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He left. Mara turned back to the corridor, to the ongoing noise and movement and the next patient in the next bay, and she was already moving when she heard it. A sound from outside, cutting through the ambient noise of the hospital, growing louder. Multiple vehicles. Heavy engines. Moving fast. She didn't stop walking, but her chin lifted slightly and something changed behind her eyes. Something that looked, to the few people watching her closely enough to notice, like the very last thing any of them had expected. Not surprise. Familiarity. The vehicles came around the north corner of the hospital's service drive, 3 of them, moving in tight formation. 2 dark SUVs with government plates bracketing a third vehicle that was heavier, blacker, the kind of thing that didn't come with a manufacturer's logo visible from the outside. They pulled into the ambulance staging area without asking permission and parked across 2 reserved lanes, and nobody moved to stop them. Mara was already at the far end of the corridor when they arrived. She didn't go to the window. She had a patient to finish assessing, a 40-year-old man with a probable C5 strain and a laceration on his forearm that had been bandaged in the field but not properly cleaned, and she was working through that now, methodically, because the patient in front of her was the patient in front of her regardless of what was happening outside. "You're going to feel some pressure," she told him. "What was that sound?" he asked. He was a nervous talker, had been since they'd gotten him settled. "Those engines sounded like military." "Could be," she said. "Is that... Are they here for the crash?" "Hold still, please." She finished the wound irrigation and was reaching for the closure strips when Felicia appeared at the bay curtain with an expression Mara hadn't seen on her before. Not the drowning list face from earlier, something more careful, more watchful. "There are people asking for you," Felicia said. Mara didn't look up immediately. She pressed the first closure strip into place. "What kind of people?" "The kind with uniforms and no explanation." The second strip, the third. "Tell them I'm with a patient." Felicia made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and dry and a little disbelieving. "Mara, these are not people you make wait. Everybody waits when someone's getting treated." She smoothed the edge of the last strip and turned to the patient. "Don't get that wet for 24 hours. If it opens or shows any sign of swelling, come back immediately. Don't wait to see if it gets better." The man was no longer looking at his arm. He was looking at Felicia, then at Mara, with the particular confusion of someone who has realized they are adjacent to a situation they do not understand. "Should I be worried?" he asked. "About the wound?" "No," Mara said. "Sit tight until someone processes your discharge paperwork." She stepped out of the bay. The corridor had changed in the few minutes she'd been behind the curtain. The emergency had not resolved. There were still patients, still movement, still the layered noise of a trauma floor managing more than its comfortable load, but something had shifted in the ambient attention of the staff. People were looking toward the ER entrance. 2 nurses had positioned themselves with the very specific kind of non-obvious vantage point that meant they were watching something without wanting to appear to watch it. Mara followed the sight lines. There were 4 of them in the entrance corridor, outside the ER bay doors. 3 in uniform, Army, she noted without needing to think about it, the branch identifiable from the insignia at 20 feet, and 1 in civilian clothes who carried himself in a way that made the civilian clothes almost beside the point. The one in civilian clothes was talking to a hospital administrator Mara didn't recognize, a woman who had appeared from somewhere in the administrative wing and was now holding a tablet and looking uncertain about whether to be accommodating or firm. The uniformed personnel were not looking at the administrator. They were looking down the corridor, toward Mara. She kept walking. Same pace. She had decided sometime in the last 30 seconds, without fully forming the decision into words, that she was going to let this happen on her terms rather than anyone else's, which meant she was going to walk toward it at the speed she chose. The civilian stepped forward when she was 10 feet away. Ms. Weston. His voice was even, practiced. My name is Garrett Osley. I'm with the Department of Defense, Office of Special Programs. We need to speak with you privately. I know what OSP is, she said. Something shifted in his expression. The first micro-adjustment, a recalibration. Then you understand that this conversation is time-sensitive. Everything in this building right now is time-sensitive. She looked at him steadily. I've got 15 minutes before I need to check on a post-stabilization patient. You can have 10 of them. He almost smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of professional recognition. 10 minutes is fine. They used the small family consultation room off the east corridor. Windowless, 4 chairs, a box of tissues on the table that had been there long enough to gather dust at the edges. Mara sat across from Osley. One of the uniformed personnel, a captain, she'd now confirmed, Army Medical Corps, remained standing near the door. The other 2 stayed in the corridor. Osley set a thin folder on the table. He did not open it. We've been aware of your location for several months, he said. I assumed. We weren't tracking you. We want to be clear about that. Your service record includes a standard civilian resettlement flag, which generates a passive notification if certain proximity conditions are met. You became a proximity match when Harrowgate enrolled in a federal emergency preparedness grant program 18 months ago. He paused. You weren't the reason we were here today. The bus accident triggered a federal mass casualty notification protocol, and we were already en route to assess the hospital's surge capacity when we received a secondary alert. She waited. The secondary alert, he continued, was a report filed 40 minutes ago by a Dr. Robert Calloway, senior attending, describing an ongoing administrative interference situation that he characterized as compromising emergency care delivery. He opened the folder. The top document had a header she recognized, not the specific form, but the type of it. Internal Escalation Chain, DoD, Civilian Oversight. Dr. Calloway used specific language that triggered a flag in the grant compliance system. He described the interference as, and I'm quoting, deliberate obstruction of emergency medical response by administrative personnel who do not appear to understand their obligations under federal emergency preparedness guidelines. Mara said nothing. He also, Osley added, and now there was something in his tone that was not quite dry but adjacent to it, mentioned you by name 3 times. Calloway is thorough, she said. Miss Weston. He closed the folder. We know your service history, the full version, not the redacted civilian record. We know what you did in the Korengal, and we know why your service record has the classification level it has. That's not why we're here. He leaned forward slightly. We're here because this hospital is enrolled in a federally funded emergency preparedness program, which means it has obligations, and based on what we observed walking through that ER in the last 20 minutes, those obligations are not being met. And we're here because someone with your background is currently being processed for removal by an administrator who... He stopped himself. The professional surface reasserted. There are several things happening simultaneously, he said, and we need your account of events. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the bag she'd set on the table, pulled out her phone, and placed it in front of him. I've been documenting since October. Dates, direct quotes, names of staff present. There are also 2 informal HR complaints on file that were not acted on. She looked at the captain by the door. And there are at least 4 other staff members who have verbal accounts they haven't put in writing because they're afraid of losing their jobs. One of them is a facilities supervisor named Terrence Okafor. Osley looked at the phone. He looked at her. You prepared for this, he said. I prepared for the possibility, she corrected. He picked up the phone. He handed it to the captain. The captain stepped out of the room. Osley sat back in his chair. He had the look, now, of someone who had come expecting a straightforward assessment and was revising his expectations. I want to ask you something that's outside my official scope, he said. You can ask. Why didn't you leave months ago, when it was clear the institution wasn't going to address it? She'd been asked versions of this question before, by people who meant it differently, by her therapist, by her sister, once, on the phone, in a conversation that had been gentle and not quite landing. She had different answers for different contexts. She thought about which answer was true enough to be worth saying. Because I was good at the job, she said, and the patients needed someone who was good at the job. Owsley nodded slowly. He seemed to find that adequate. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, we go have a conversation with your administrator. Dale Voss was in his office on the third floor when the knock came. He'd expected Hargreave, his assistant, or possibly legal. He'd already made 2 calls in the past hour, both strategic, both aimed at getting ahead of whatever Calloway's complaint was going to generate. He was not, in any version of his mental preparation, expecting to open his office door and find a federal officer in civilian clothes accompanied by an army captain and a very specific look of institutional patience. Mr. Voss. Owsley introduced himself the same way he'd introduced himself to Mara. Name, office, nothing more. We'd like a few minutes. Voss had the particular skill of a certain kind of executive, the ability to project confidence in almost any situation as a reflex. He called it reading the room. What it actually was, more precisely, was performing for the room regardless of what he'd read. Of course, he said. Come in. They came in. Voss closed the door. He did not sit behind his desk, a subtle power move he'd developed over years, but leaned against the front edge of it, arms partially crossed, projecting ease. I assume this is about the emergency response today, he said. Happy to walk you through our protocols. Harrowgate has a strong track record on Mr. Voss, Owsley said. I'm going to be direct with you because it saves time. We're here under the emergency preparedness compliance provisions of the federal grant agreement Harrowgate signed in March of last year. Under Section 14 of that agreement, the hospital is subject to immediate review in the event of a mass casualty incident, and that review includes personnel decisions made during and immediately prior to the event. He paused. We're specifically looking at the suspension issued this morning to a staff nurse, Mara Weston, and the attempt to remove her from the emergency response during active triage. Voss's posture didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes, a rapid recalculation that he was almost skilled enough to hide. Ms. Weston was suspended for documented conduct issues that preceded today's the suspension documentation, the captain said, first time she'd spoken, voice flat and precise, was issued at 9:47 a.m. The mass casualty alert was issued at 1:22 p.m. At 2:31 p.m., according to 3 witnessed accounts, you entered the ER and attempted to have Ms. Weston removed during active patient triage. Is that accurate? A beat. I was enforcing a valid suspension. During a mass casualty event, Owsley said, under federal grant terms, that action is classified as interference with emergency medical response, which is a compliance violation, which is why we're having this conversation. Voss uncrossed his arms. He was recalculating again, and this time the recalculation was more visible. I wasn't aware of the specific grant language around. That's noted, Owsley said. He didn't say it unkindly exactly, but he said it in the way that meant it was going on the record. There was a knock on the office door. Voss's assistant, Hargreave, opened it a crack. Dale, there's... He saw the people in the room. He stopped. Not now, Voss said. Hargreave didn't move. He had the look of someone who had come with news he'd decided in the last second he didn't know how to deliver. There are more people downstairs, in the lobby. Voss frowned. More of different people, Hargreave said. He glanced at Owsley. Military, in uniform, senior. A pause. One of them has stars on his collar. The room shifted. Owsley turned to the captain. Something passed between them. A look, professionally minimal, that still somehow communicated a great deal. That would be General Harmon, the captain said, and said it in a way that made it clear she was informing Owsley, not Voss, and that she had not expected this either. Voss looked from the captain to Owsley. Who is General Harmon? Neither of them answered him. Mara was back in the ER when the general arrived. She'd used the time after the consultation room to check her post-stabilization patients, confirmed the 11 o'clock antibiotic for room 412 had been given, it had, Debbie had handled it, and helped Felicia close out the triage backlog, which was finally, slowly, beginning to clear. The crisis peak had passed. The ER was still busy but no longer on the edge. 3 of the most critical patients had been moved to surgical. The child from Bay 7 was in the pediatric ICU, stable, her parents having arrived 30 minutes ago in the specific state of terror and relief that Mara had learned, over years, to navigate. She was updating a chart at the nurse's station when the lobby doors opened. He came through first, tall, 60-something, in army dress uniform with the kind of presence that reorganizes a room without announcing itself. The stars were on his collar, as reported. Behind him were 2 aides, also in uniform, and behind them, almost as an afterthought, the 2 OSP personnel who'd been stationed in the corridor. Several people in the lobby stopped what they were doing. The general did not look around the way visitors do. He looked for a specific thing, and he found it in about 4 seconds. His eyes went down the corridor and landed on Mara. She set down the chart. He walked toward her. The aides followed. The lobby, which had been a manageable level of busy, went conspicuously quiet. He stopped 6 feet away. He was looking at her with an expression that Mara found difficult to categorize. It was not warm exactly, and not purely professional, and there was something in it she'd need to think about later when she wasn't in the middle of a hospital corridor with a lot of people watching. "Ms. Weston," he said. His voice was measured. "I'm General Leo Harmon. We haven't met, but I've read your file. All of it." She stood with her hands at her sides. "General, I'm told you stabilized a pediatric tamponade this afternoon. I identified the risk. Dr. Calloway stabilized her. And a probable splenic lac." Same answer. He studied her for a moment. "How many patients did you triage personally?" She thought back. 11. Assessment on 11, active direction on about 22. He was quiet for a second. "In what time frame?" 40, 45 minutes. A pause. "I've seen operating triage in Kandahar that looked less organized than what the staff here described," he said. She didn't respond to that. Harmon turned slightly, addressed one of his aides, and said something in a low voice. The aide nodded and moved away toward the administrative corridor. Then the general turned back to Mara. "I'd like to talk," he said, "about some things that don't belong in a corridor. I've had a lot of corridor conversations today." "I know." Not apologetic, but something close to acknowledging. "I'll try to be brief. They used Calloway's office, borrowed with the doctor's permission, and the slightly dazed expression of a man who was processing the fact that a 2-star general was using his desk. Calloway himself hovered near the door for a moment and then apparently decided he had things to do and left. Harmon sat. Mara sat across from him. The aides stayed outside. "In 2017, Harmon said, a forward operating base in Kunar province was hit during what should have been a routine resupply operation. 19 wounded, 6 critical. The base medic was one of the 19. The nearest medevac was 40 minutes out." He looked at her steadily. "The person who ran triage in that window had 18 months of field medical training and was technically a support specialist, not a medic. She organized the available personnel, used field supplies that were not intended for the injuries she was treating, and kept all 6 critical patients alive until the helicopters arrived." Mara was quiet. "I was the commanding officer of that operation," Harmon said. "I was not present at the base when it was hit. I was on a command call 7 kilometers away. The after-action report was the first time I read your name." She looked at him. This was not new information. She knew who had written the commendation. She had chosen not to know who had authorized it. "I should have made contact before now," he said. "I didn't." He didn't explain why, didn't offer it as a failure or a justification, just stated it. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Some things don't run on a statute of limitations." She didn't argue that. "What I want to know," he said, "is what you want to happen here. Not what the DoD wants, not what compliance needs, what you want." It was a disarming question, and she suspected he knew it was disarming, and she found that she was willing to engage with it anyway. "I want the other staff to be protected," she said. "There are people in this building who've been managing the same situation I've been managing for longer than I have. That needs to stop." "And professionally?" She thought. "I want my record to reflect what actually happened today, not Voss's version of it." Harmon nodded. "That's being handled." He paused. "Is there anything else?" She looked at him for a moment. There was something she'd been carrying since the cafeteria this morning. Not the specific event, but the longer accumulation of events that had been building toward it, and the specific fatigue of being precise and contained and measured for months, while the thing you were being precise and contained about kept escalating. "I want it to be over," she said. He looked at her with the expression she hadn't been able to categorize in the lobby. She placed it now. It was the look of someone who had made a decision some time ago and was confirming, in this moment, that the decision had been right. "Then let's end it," he said. The meeting happened at 4:45 p.m. in the Harrowgate boardroom on the 3rd floor. Mara wasn't in the meeting. She found this appropriate. She was downstairs helping with the remaining post-acute intake from the bus crash, doing the work she'd come here to do, while upstairs in a conference room with inadequate natural light and a view of the parking structure. A collection of people were having a conversation that was going to determine what the next chapter of her professional life looked like. She knew some of what was happening up there. Osley had been specific about procedure, compliance review, the suspension documentation, the cafeteria incident, the ER interference. The captain had Mara's phone documentation, which she'd transferred and which ran to 47 separate entries. Terence Okafor had arrived at the hospital at 3:30 p.m., and had gone directly to the administrative wing with a folder of his own, which he'd been quietly assembling since October. What she didn't know was the angle from Harmon's office. Whatever he was carrying, whatever his presence here meant beyond the official compliance channel, that was a set of pieces she didn't have the full picture on yet. Downstairs, a woman who'd been on the bus and had spent 3 hours in triage caught Mara's arm as she was passing and said simply, "Thank you." The woman was maybe 50. Had a bandage on her temple, and the particular shaken quality of someone recently returned from somewhere they hadn't expected to go. She didn't know who Mara was or what was happening upstairs. She just knew that this woman in worn scrubs had spoken to her during the worst 2 hours she could remember and had been calm in a way that was contagious. "You're going to be okay," Mara told her. She said it practically, not softly, checked the woman's pupils, asked about her headache level on a scale of 1 to 10, confirmed she'd been seen by a neurologist. The woman nodded. She didn't let go of Mara's arm for another moment. Mara let her hold it. "Oh." Voss came out of the boardroom at 6:12 p.m. Mara was in the corridor near the elevator bank, not waiting, specifically, just finishing a note at the standing station near the wall, when he appeared. He had 2 administrators with him she recognized from his usual orbit, and all 3 of them had the slightly flattened quality of people who had spent 90 minutes being managed by people with more institutional authority than them. He saw her. She looked up from the note. What passed between them in that moment was not dramatic. That was the thing she noticed afterward. She'd expected, on some level, a confrontation of commensurate scale to everything that had preceded it. Instead, it was just a man in expensive shoes who looked, for the first time in the 14 months she'd known him, genuinely uncertain. "Weston," he said. She waited. His jaw moved. There was something he'd prepared to say. She could see the shape of it. And then the thing he'd prepared met the reality of standing in the corridor with her, and the words rearranged themselves. "I didn't know about your background." She looked at him for a moment. "Which part?" He didn't have an answer for that. "The part where I was at Harrowgate for a year and a half," she said, "and you treated me the way you did. Does that get different if you know I have a commendation? Does it get different if I'd deployed twice instead of 3 times? Does it get different if the general hadn't walked in today?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Because if the answer is yes," she said, "then you're saying that the way you treated me was about what you didn't know, not about what you did." She put the cap on her pen. "And that's the problem. That's exactly what the problem is." He was quiet for a long time. His 2 administrators had gone very still beside him, making themselves as invisible as 2 people in suits in a bright corridor could manage. Voss looked at the floor. When he looked up again, something had shifted in his face. Not remorse exactly, and not understanding, but possibly the very beginning of something that might, given enough time and enough difficulty, eventually become one of those things. "What happens now?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "That's not my decision." She walked away from him down the corridor. She heard the elevator open and close. She heard the receding sound of the two administrators saying something to him in low voices. She didn't look back. At the end of the corridor, Felicia was waiting with 2 cups of coffee from the break room, holding them out with the expression of someone who had spent the last 5 hours running a trauma floor and had approximately 7 things to say and was managing them in order of importance. "Here," Felicia said. Mara took the cup. "How are we sitting?" "Last 3 post-acutes are stable. The pediatric is doing well. They upgraded her an hour ago. The splenic lac came out of surgery clean." Felicia paused. "Debbie covered for you with the board. Said you were rendering emergency care as a licensed professional responding to a mass casualty event, which is technically accurate and also brilliant." "Debbie is underutilized," Mara said. "I know." Felicia drank her coffee. They stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of a hospital floor after a crisis, the kind of quiet that has texture to it, a tiredness that isn't unpleasant because it's earned. "Are you okay?" Mara thought about this. Her hip still ached where it had hit the table. She was running on 4 hours of sleep and hospital coffee and the specific controlled energy she'd learned to sustain from years of practice, which meant the crash was coming and was going to be unpleasant. "I will be," she said. Felicia nodded like she understood the distinction. From upstairs, from the administrative wing specifically, from the boardroom with the view of the parking structure, they heard voices. Not clear enough to parse, but the cadence was specific, raised, not in anger but in the particular register of official determination. A door opening. More voices. Both of them looked toward the stairwell. "I think something's happening," Felicia said. "Yeah," Mara said. She drank her coffee. She waited. And then Terence Okafor appeared at the top of the stairwell, moving fast, his face doing something complicated. He came down 2 steps and stopped when he saw Mara, and for a second he just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "They pulled the security footage," he said. "The cafeteria and the ER." She kept her face neutral. "And?" Okafor exhaled. "There's more on that footage than just today." He looked at her steadily. "A lot more, from the last 8 months." He paused. Voss didn't know which cameras covered which angles. He thought the cafeteria northeast corner was a blind spot. The coffee in her hand had gone slightly cold. She didn't notice. "There are 6 other staff members on that footage," Okafor said. 6 separate incidents. 3 of them are still employed here. 2 of them resigned in the last 4 months without filing anything. Something moved through the air between the 3 of them. Felicia had gone very still. "How bad is it?" Mara asked. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. "Bad enough that the General's aide placed a call to the Inspector General's office 20 minutes ago." The stairwell door opened again above them. An aide appeared. Not Harmon's aide, someone new, someone Mara hadn't seen before, and leaned over the railing to look down. "Ms. Weston," the aide said, "General Harmon is asking for you." Mara set down her coffee cup on the edge of the nursing station. She looked at Felicia and then at Okafor. She didn't say anything. She went up the stairs. The boardroom door was open when she reached the 3rd floor. Through it, she could see Harmon standing at the head of the table, Osley to his left, and on the far side of the room, behind glass in the glass-walled office that connected to the boardroom, Dale Voss. He was sitting in a chair. He was not alone. There was a woman across from him she didn't recognize. 40s, precise posture, a notepad, the specific stillness of someone conducting an interview. She was not from the hospital. She was not from OSP. Harmon saw Mara in the doorway. He gestured her in. "I want to show you something," he said, and reached across the table to a laptop that was open to a video file. He turned it toward her. The timestamp read 8 weeks ago. The location, based on the angle, was the 3rd-floor corridor outside the research offices, a stretch of hallway Mara had walked dozens of times and never thought twice about. She watched. 30 seconds in, she understood why he wanted her to see it. And for the first time since morning, since the cafeteria and the shove and the suspension letter and all of it, something that had been held very tightly in her chest began to loosen. Not into relief, not yet, but into the specific feeling of a weight transferring. Of a thing she had been carrying alone beginning to be carried by something larger than herself. She kept watching. The footage was 43 seconds long. It had been recorded by a fixed camera in the third-floor corridor outside the research offices, a camera Voss apparently believed was angled away from the alcove beside the copy room. He'd been wrong by about 15 degrees. The timestamp read 8 weeks ago, a Tuesday, 6:47 p.m., when most of the administrative staff had already cleared out. The footage showed Voss and a man Mara recognized as Harrowgate's director of finance, a thin-faced administrator named Pruitt, standing in the alcove. Between them was a third person, a woman, younger, in scrubs. Mara didn't know her name, but recognized the department badge color. Research nursing. The woman had her back against the wall and her arms crossed in a way that was not casual. Voss was talking. The footage had no audio, but Mara had spent enough time reading body language in environments where misreading it had consequences. And what she read in those 43 seconds was a sequence. Pressure, refusal, escalation, a hand placed on the woman's shoulder that was not a reassuring gesture, a folder pushed into her hands, a long stillness, and then the woman walking away down the corridor with the specific gait of someone who has agreed to something they didn't want to agree to. Pruitt watched her go. Then he said something to Voss that made Voss glance briefly toward the camera. The footage ended. Mara stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and kept her face even. The room was quiet around her. Harmon at the head of the table, Osley to the side, and Aide near the door. "Who is she?" Mara asked. "Her name is Brianna Solano," Osley said. "She was a research nurse on the third floor. She resigned 6 weeks ago. No formal complaint filed." "What was in the folder?" Harmon and Osley exchanged a look. "That's what the woman in Voss's office is working on," Harmon said. "Based on Ms. Solano's employment records and the research department's project timeline, we believe the folder contained documentation pressuring her to alter patient data in a federally funded clinical trial. The weight of that landed differently than anything that had come before it. Mara had built her case around harassment and hostile work environment, real, documented, damaging. This was something with a different shape entirely. "Research fraud," she said. "Potential research fraud," Osley corrected, with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the line was. "The investigation is in early stages, but the compliance implications under the federal grant terms," he stopped. "If it holds up, this stops being an HR matter." Mara looked at the frozen frame on the laptop screen. Brianna Solano's back, the folder in her hands, the exit corridor ahead of her. "She's going to need to be contacted," Mara said. "Carefully. If she was pressured into falsifying data and she knows an investigation has started, she might—" "We're aware," Harmon said. He said it without dismissing her, more like confirming that the thing she was worried about was already on someone's list. "That's being handled through proper channels." "I want Okafor in the room for whatever comes next," Mara said. "He's been building a parallel record for months. If you're constructing a timeline, his documentation fills gaps mine doesn't." Harmon nodded at the aide, who wrote something down. The woman interviewing Voss, or Mara could see her through the glass, profile turned, notepad in hand, asked a question, and Voss leaned forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands laced together. He looked, from this angle, smaller than he'd ever looked in the building before. But by 7:30 p.m., Harrowgate had become two separate institutions occupying the same physical space. The floors below the third were still a hospital, patients in beds, monitors running, the night shift cycling in, the sustained mechanical rhythm of a building that didn't stop because something significant was happening upstairs. A child in the pediatric ICU was asking her parents for a specific cartoon. The man with the C5 strain was being discharged with written instructions. The bus crash patients still in observation were being checked on the standard schedule. Upstairs, the investigative machinery had taken on its own momentum. 2 more people had been asked to come in and give accounts. Debbie Holtz, who arrived with her own written notes dating back 4 months, and Dr. Yuen, the resident who had watched Mara walk the length of the corridor that morning with the expression Mara had never quite placed. He came in looking tired and slightly relieved, the way people look when they've been carrying something and are finally allowed to set it down. Mara was in the consultation room again, the windowless one with the dusty tissue box, going through her documented timeline with one of Osley's staff, a woman named Petra, who asked precise questions and wrote fast. They'd been at it for 40 minutes. Mara's voice had gone flat from the sustained focus of it, not emotional, just the tiredness of reconstruction, pulling dates back to the surface, matching them to names and locations, confirming the sequence. Petra looked up. The morning of December 2nd, you noted a comment made at the nursing station. You listed 3 witnesses but flagged one as uncertain. Patricia Odom. She was at the end of the station. She may not have been close enough to hear the specific wording, just the tone. Do you know if she's still employed here? Yes. Night charge on this floor, Petra wrote. And the incident on November 14th. A knock at the door. One of Harmon's aides opened it. Ms. Weston, the general is asking for you again. Mara looked at Petra. We can pick this up, Petra said. The 3rd floor had a different atmosphere now than it had 90 minutes ago. More people, more purpose. 2 people Mara hadn't seen before were at a workstation near the boardroom with laptops open, running something that required sustained attention. Through the glass of the adjacent office, she could see that Voss was no longer being interviewed. He was sitting alone with the particular stillness of someone who has been told to wait and understands, finally, the full weight of what they're waiting for. Harmon was in the corridor with a phone at his ear. He finished the call as Mara approached and put the phone away. Brianna Solano agreed to speak with us, he said. She's coming in voluntarily. She's bringing a lawyer, which is appropriate. He paused. But she called Osley's line directly, not legal. That means she already wanted to talk. Mara nodded. There's something else. He handed her a single printed page. This came through while you were with Petra. She read it. It was a summary document, brief, administrative language, but the content hit clearly. A preliminary review of the clinical trial data from the research department's current federally funded study had identified statistical anomalies in 4 patient outcome records. The anomalies were consistent with retrospective alteration. The trial sponsor, a pharmaceutical company based in Seattle, had been notified. The IRB is being contacted tonight, Harmon said. The trial is being suspended pending full audit. How many patients are in the trial? 61 enrolled, 47 active. She thought about what that meant. 47 people who had enrolled in a clinical trial with the understanding that their data was being handled with integrity, whose outcomes might be part of a record that someone had put their hands on and adjusted for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. Something that had been building in her chest all day, the compressed weight of the cafeteria and the suspension letter and the ER and everything since, shifted into something else. Not anger, not exactly, more like clarity. The kind that comes when you've been looking at a thing from one angle for a long time, and then it rotates and you see how much larger it actually was. Voss knew about the trial data, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so, Harmon said. Pruitt almost certainly ran the numbers. Voss provided the administrative cover. He looked at her directly, which reframes why he was so aggressive about removing staff who might observe things they shouldn't. She thought about the 14 months. The documentation requests, the scoped-out comments about nurses exceeding their role, the particular pattern of who got targeted and when. She thought about the 2 staff members who'd resigned without filing complaints. She thought about Brianna Solano walking down that corridor with a folder she hadn't wanted. He wasn't just protecting himself from harassment claims, she said. No, Harmon said. He was protecting a much larger exposure, which meant her presence, her refusal to leave quietly, her documentation, her continued competence in visible situations that made her hard to dismiss, had been threatening something significantly bigger than one administrator's ego. She stood with that for a moment. Are you all right? Harmon asked. I'm working on it, she said. He accepted that. He didn't push. At 8:55 p.m., Dale Voss was formally placed on administrative leave. The announcement was made by Harrowgate's chief medical officer, Dr. Anita Rourke, a woman who had been largely absent from the day's events until approximately an hour ago, when Harmon's aide had delivered a documented summary to her home address, and she had driven in with a speed that suggested she understood the magnitude of arriving late to this particular moment. Rourke was 63, had been CMO for 9 years, and had the expression of someone who had believed until very recently that the institution she ran was substantially what it appeared to be. The footage and the preliminary trial data and Okafor's documentation and the 7 staff accounts had revised that belief in the space of one evening, and the revision was visible on her face. She found Mara in the corridor near the stairwell. "Miss Weston," Rourke said, "I owe you an apology. 2, actually. 1 institutional and 1 personal." Mara waited. "The institutional one is straightforward. The HR process failed you. There will be a structural review." Rourke paused. "The personal one is harder to deliver because it requires me to admit that I was aware of a pattern of complaints about Mr. Voss that I did not pursue with sufficient urgency. I believe the structure around him was adequate containment. I was wrong." It was a more direct admission than Mara had expected. She gave Rourke credit for that. "What happens to the staff who filed complaints before mine?" Mara asked. "The 2 who resigned. That will be part of the review. We'll make contact." Rourke held her gaze. "I want to be honest with you. There are things in motion tonight that are beyond the hospital's control now. The IG involvement, the trial audit. Some of this has consequences I can't fully predict. I understand that. I also want you to know—" Rourke stopped, started again. "What you did in that ER today." "What doctor?" Calloway described. "Several people have described." She seemed to be choosing her words with care. "I'm aware of the irony of the institution that suspended you this morning, now standing here saying that your presence here today made a material difference to patient outcomes. I'm not going to minimize that irony." "I don't need you to," Mara said. Rourke nodded. There was a long pause. "Your suspension is rescinded, effective immediately. I'd like you back on active status." Mara looked at her steadily. "I'll think about it." Rourke blinked, clearly not the answer she'd prepared for. "That's—" She stopped. "Of course. That's your right." She left. Mara stood in the corridor. The building had settled into its night rhythm around her. Quieter, steadier, the way hospitals go when the acute events have passed and the sustained work takes over. Down the hall, 2 night nurses were talking in low voices. An IV pump alarmed briefly and then stopped. Somewhere above her, the investigators were still working. She was exhausted. Genuinely, physically exhausted in a way she'd been managing with controlled focus all day and was now allowing herself to register. Her hip had a deep ache she'd been ignoring. She hadn't eaten since 7 a.m. The crash she'd known was coming had announced its arrival with a weight behind her eyes and a slight tremble in her hands that she recognized as adrenaline debt. She was going to go home. She was going to eat something and sleep and process all of this in the morning when she could think in a straight line. She was almost to the elevator when Okafor appeared from the stairwell. He had his coat on. He'd been there since 3:30 and he looked it, but there was something loosened in his posture, not relaxed exactly, but unburdened in the specific way of someone who has finally put something down they'd been carrying for a long time. "I'm heading out," he said. "Me too." They walked to the elevator together, stood waiting for it in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through a complicated day and don't need to fill the space. The elevator opened. They stepped in. "You know," Okafor said as the doors closed, "I almost didn't call you this morning." "I know. I spent about 20 minutes talking myself out of it." "What changed your mind?" He thought about it. "The look on your face," he said, "when you checked that room. You weren't scared and you weren't angry. You were building something." He paused. "I've only ever seen that look on people who already know how the fight ends." The elevator opened on the ground floor. They stepped out into the lobby, which was quiet now, the crisis intake long cleared, the night security at the desk, the institutional lighting doing its flat, tireless work. They pushed through the main doors into the December cold. The parking lot was dark and still. The 3 government vehicles were still staged in the ambulance lane. One of the SUVs had its engine running, exhaust rising in the cold air. As Mara and Okafor stepped onto the pavement, the rear door of the running SUV opened and Garrett Osley stepped out. He was holding his phone. His expression had changed from the careful professional neutrality of the boardroom. What was on his face now was specific, the look of someone who has received information and is still deciding how to deliver it. "Ms. Weston," he said. She stopped. "What?" Brianna Solano's lawyer called 10 minutes ago. He paused. Miss Solano isn't coming in voluntarily. Mara waited. She's in Harrowgate's ER. She was brought in by ambulance 20 minutes ago. Osley looked at her steadily. She collapsed at home. Her roommate found her. The paramedics are describing it as a potential overdose. The cold air settled around all three of them. Is she? Mara started. She's alive. They're working on her. Osley's voice was level, but something underneath it was not. Her lawyer is saying it wasn't intentional, that she's been under extreme pressure for weeks, and it may have been an accident. He paused. But her phone was recovered at the scene, and the last call she made 2 hours ago was to a number registered to a Shell LLC that our team has been tracing since this afternoon. Okafor had gone completely still beside her. The LLC, Mara said. Traces to a board member, Osley said. Not Voss. Someone above Voss. The running SUV idled in the dark. Somewhere inside the hospital, in the ER she had stood in 12 hours ago and directed triage and argued with a man who had believed he was untouchable. A young woman was being kept alive by the same machinery Mara had learned to trust and fear in equal measure. And somewhere in the building behind her, the investigation that had started as a harassment complaint had just become something that reached higher and farther and darker than anyone standing in this parking lot had fully understood when the day began. Osley looked at her. We need to go back in, he said. They went back in. The ER at 9:14 p.m. was a different animal than the ER at 1:48 p.m. Quieter in volume, tighter in tension, the night staff doing their precise and unglamorous work under fluorescent light, while something urgent was happening behind the bay curtain at the far end. Mara identified Brianna Solano's location by the density of movement around Bay 12. 2 nurses, a resident, the particular focused stillness of people managing something that had not resolved yet. She didn't go to Bay 12. That wasn't her patient, and it wasn't her role, and the best thing she could do for Brianna Solano right now was stay out of the way of the people doing the work. Osley was already on his phone 3 steps behind her, talking in a voice too low to follow. Okafor had come back in without being asked. He stood near the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of someone who had gone home in his mind and was now recalibrating. The attending on overnight was a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, mid-40s, deliberate, the kind of doctor who didn't raise his voice because he'd learned that calm was more efficient than urgency in most situations. He stepped out from behind the Bay 12 curtain, saw Mara, and came toward her with his tablet in one hand. "You're Weston," he said. Not a question. Word had apparently moved through the building. "How is she?" Mara asked. "Stable. Respiratory depression on arrival. They got her on naloxone in the field, and she's responding." He glanced at his tablet. "Opioid tox. The amount in her system wasn't lethal at the time she took it, but she was alone, and if her roommate had come home 2 hours later, he left that where it was. She's conscious, not fully coherent yet. The lawyer showed up 10 minutes ago and is currently in the waiting area being managed by your friend Felicia, which..." He paused, something moving across his face that was not quite a smile. "Felicia is handling that. Is she going to talk?" "That's not a medical determination." He looked at her steadily. "But she asked for you." Mara went still. "She doesn't know me." "She asked for the nurse who ran triage this afternoon, by description." Webb tilted his head slightly. Apparently her roommate mentioned something she'd seen on the hospital's internal announcement board. Some kind of staff communication about today's emergency response. He paused. "I don't know what it said, but Solano heard it and asked if you were still in the building." Mara looked at the bay curtain. She thought about the 43 seconds of footage, Solano's back, the folder, the corridor ahead of her. "I'll talk to her," Mara said, "but I need Osley in the building when I do. Whatever she says..." "I know," Webb said. "I've already had 2 people from the federal team here asking about chain of evidence protocols for patient statements. This is not my first unusual evening." He said it dry, without complaint, and moved back toward his patient. Mara waited 20 minutes before going in. She used the time practically, found the vending machine, ate something she didn't taste, drank water, let her hands stop their faint trembling. She sat in a plastic chair in the corridor and breathed, slowly, the way she'd learned to manage adrenaline debt when there was still work ahead. Osley appeared at 9:38, off the phone, with the particular compressed quality of someone who had been receiving information in rapid sequence and was now processing the cumulative weight of it. The LLC traces to a Harrowgate board member named Jeffrey Wade, he said, sitting in the chair beside her without preamble. He's been on the board for 11 years. He also sits on the investment committee for the pharmaceutical company sponsoring the clinical trial. He looked at her. That's not an administrative oversight. That's a direct conflict of interest that should have been disclosed at enrollment and wasn't. So the trial data wasn't being altered to protect outcomes, Mara said. It was being altered to protect valuation. That's the working theory. Osley leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. If the trial data showed stronger outcomes than actually occurred, the sponsoring company's pipeline looks better to investors. Wade held a significant position in that company through a fund structure that obscures direct ownership, but our financial team found it in about 4 hours. He paused. Voss was the mechanism. Wade was the reason. Mara looked at the wall opposite. And Brianna Solano found out. We think she was asked to make the alterations directly. When she refused, or tried to document her refusal, the pressure escalated. Osley was quiet for a moment. The call she made tonight was to a number that routes to Wade's personal assistant. Not Wade directly, the assistant. Someone was managing her. Managing her distress, yes, in the worst possible way. He sat back. Wade has been notified that he is subject to a federal inquiry. His lawyer called us 35 minutes ago. He is currently preparing a statement through counsel, which means he knows the scope and is not planning to cooperate voluntarily. Can he slow the investigation? He can complicate it. He has institutional connections and the kind of legal team that specializes in delay. Osley looked at her directly. Which is why Solano's account, if she's willing and able to give it, matters significantly. She was in the room. She has direct knowledge. Everything else we have right now is documented, but it's circumstantial in terms of Wade's specific involvement. Mara understood the weight of what he was not quite asking. I'm not going to pressure her, she said. I know that. I'm going to go in there as a nurse, she said. Not as a witness coordinator. I know that too. He held her gaze. I'm telling you the stakes so you have the full picture. What you do with it is your call. She stood up. She adjusted her badge, still technically clipped to her jacket from this morning, the suspension that hadn't deactivated in time and was now rescinded, and walked to Bay 12. Brianna Solano was 29. That was Mara's first recalibration. She'd been imagining someone younger, perhaps from the posture in the footage, the way she'd held her arms. In person, in the hospital bed with the overhead light dimmed and a nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen, she looked 29 exactly. Not young in any naive sense, but young in the sense of someone who had not yet developed the specific armor that comes from surviving the thing she had just almost not survived. Her eyes were open. They tracked to Mara in the doorway. You're her, Solano said. Her voice was rough, not fully coordinated. The naloxone was good at reversal, but it left people feeling like they'd been taken apart and inexpertly reassembled. Mara Weston. Mara pulled the chair to the bedside and sat, not standing over her, even height or close to it. How's your breathing? Better than an hour ago. A pause. They told me what I took. You don't have to talk about that right now. Solano looked at the ceiling for a moment. I've been trying to figure out for 6 weeks how to get out of it without losing everything. Her voice was flat, not self-pitying, more like someone reading a situation report on their own life. I kept thinking there was a version where I could just be quiet and it would stop. Mara waited. She didn't fill the space. It didn't stop, Solano said. No, Mara said. That's how it works. Staying quiet doesn't stop it. It just changes the timeline. Solano turned her head to look at her. They said you filed complaints back in October. 2. And it didn't do anything. Not immediately. Mara held her gaze. It did something tonight. Something moved across Solano's face, not relief yet, but the precursor to it. The look of someone who has been in a closed room for a long time and has just noticed a change in the air. My lawyer told me there are federal people here, she said. Yes. Are they going to... She stopped, started over. If I talk to them, is Wade going to... I can't tell you what the legal process looks like, Mara said, careful. I'm not the right person to walk you through that. Your lawyer is. She paused. What I can tell you is that as of tonight, the investigation has enough to proceed. You're not the only source. You're not a lone voice. She watched Solano's face. You don't have to protect anyone by staying quiet. That's already over. Solano closed her eyes. 2 tears moved down from the outer corners. Not a dramatic cry, just the physical release of something that had been held under pressure for too long. He had my performance reviews, she said, eyes still closed. Wade. He knew things about my record that he shouldn't have had access to. I think someone in HR was feeding him information. She opened her eyes. I didn't know how far it went. Mara filed that. Is there anything you need right now? Medically, I mean, anything that's not being managed. Solano looked at her. The question had plainly not been what she expected. No, the staff here has been good. Okay. Mara stood up. I'm going to get your nurse. Your oxygen saturation is where it should be, but you're going to feel rough for a few more hours, and there are things they need to monitor. She paused at the curtain. Your lawyer is in the waiting area. When you're ready, not before, you should talk to her. And then, when you decide you want to talk to the federal team, you tell your lawyer and she coordinates it. You don't do any of that alone. Solano nodded. Why are you helping me? Mara looked at her for a moment. Because 6 weeks ago you stood in a corridor and someone pushed a folder into your hands that you didn't want, and you were alone, and nobody in that building was paying attention. She let that settle. I know what that's like. She went out. At 10:45 p.m., Jeffrey Wade arrived at Harrowgate. He had not been summoned. That was the first thing Mara registered when Osley appeared at her shoulder in the corridor and said, in a voice stripped of inflection, he came voluntarily, with 2 lawyers. A pause. And a prepared statement, which meant someone had told him Solano was in the building. Someone had told him she was awake and coherent and had been seen speaking with a federal officer's point of contact. Someone inside the investigative loop had moved information they shouldn't have moved. And now the man at the center of the larger half of this problem had arrived to attempt to shape the narrative before it could be shaped without him. Mara had been in situations where the opposition moved first, and what that required was not reaction, but repositioning. You didn't chase the move. You let it complete and you looked at what it had revealed. She looked at what it had revealed. Wade was 61, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and had learned that projecting authority was almost as good as having it. He came through the main entrance with his 2 lawyers flanking him and a PR coordinator. Mara identified her by the tablet and the way she was already scanning the lobby for cameras, trailing slightly behind. He had expected, she thought, to walk into a building where he was still a board member, where his name on the organizational chart still meant something, where the natural deference people showed to institutional authority would create enough friction in the investigation machinery to buy him the time his lawyers needed. He had not expected to walk into a building where 2 federal agencies had been working for 6 hours and where the security footage from 8 weeks ago was already in evidence. Dr. Rourke intercepted him in the lobby. Mara watched from the corridor and entrance, far enough to observe, close enough to hear if voices carried. Rourke was not deferential. That was the first tell. Mara had only known Rourke for a few hours, but she had enough read on the woman to recognize that the posture she was holding now, straight, arms at her sides, face composed and cool, was not the posture of a CMO greeting a board member. It was the posture of someone who had been briefed and had made a decision about which side of a line they were standing on. Jeffrey, Rourke said. Anita, I understand there's been a significant event today. You came without being asked, Rourke said, at nearly 11 at night. One of his lawyers stepped forward, smooth, young, practiced. Dr. Rourke, Mr. Wade is here as a concerned board member to cooperate fully with any— Mr. Wade is subject to an active federal inquiry, Rourke said, and said it clearly enough that the two night security officers at the desk could hear it. His access to patient areas, staff areas, and administrative floors of this facility is suspended pending the outcome of that inquiry. That determination was made 1 hour ago. She paused. I'm going to ask you to wait in the family consultation room on the east corridor, where the federal team will meet with you at their convenience. The lawyer opened his mouth. The consultation room, Rourke said, or the parking lot. Those are the options. A silence. Wade's expression had not changed dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But something had recalibrated behind it. He had arrived expecting to manage the room and found the room already managed. He nodded once, tightly. Of course. Rourke walked him and his lawyers to the consultation room, the same room with the dusty tissue box where Mara had sat with Osley that afternoon, and closed the door behind them. She came back to the lobby, exhaled through her nose, and looked across at Mara. I've been CMO of this institution for 9 years, Rourke said, and I just told a board member he could wait in a closet or leave. You did, Mara said. That's going to have professional consequences for me regardless of how this ends. Probably, Rourke looked at her. Worth it, she said, and walked back to the elevator. Osley's team worked through the night. Mara did not. She found a chair in the break room at 11:30 p.m. and ate 2 granola bars from the vending machine and drank water and allowed herself, finally, to stop moving. The controlled state that had carried her through 14 hours of escalating circumstance did not collapse. It didn't work like that. It never had. But it released enough that she felt the full weight of the day settle into her body. Her hip ached in a deep, bone-adjacent way. Her eyes were burning. She had a headache she'd been managing since approximately 2 p.m. that had now graduated to something more insistent. Felicia found her there at midnight. She sat down across from Mara without asking, poured herself coffee from the pot that had been on since 6 p.m. and tasted like it, and drank it anyway. Solano talked, Felicia said. Her lawyer was in there with her, 2 of Osley's people. Took about 40 minutes. She paused. I wasn't in the room. But one of the aides came through here about 20 minutes ago, and he had the look of someone who'd heard something that confirmed everything. Good, Mara said. Wade is still in the consultation room. Felicia wrapped both hands around her mug. His lawyers have been filing things on their phones for 3 hours. I don't know what. My understanding of federal compliance law is limited. Mine too. Felicia looked at her. You doing okay? I said that to someone earlier, Mara said. She gave me the same answer I was planning to give you. Felicia snorted softly. I'll take that as a no. Take it as a working on it. They sat in the break room quiet for a while. Outside, the hospital continued its night operations. The monitors, the soft call system tones, the footsteps of staff moving through corridors on schedules that did not accommodate the fact that something significant had broken open in this building today. At 12:40 a.m., Osley appeared in the break room doorway. He looked like someone who had been awake for a very long time and had no intention of sleeping. He looked at Mara. Solano's account corroborates the documentary evidence on every substantive point, he said. She has emails. She forwarded them to a personal account before she was locked out of the hospital system after her resignation. Wade's assistant is named in 3 of them directly. He paused. And she has something else. A voice memo she recorded on her phone during one of the last meetings she had with Pruitt, before the resignation. Mara stared at him. How clear is it? Clear enough, Osley said, that our legal team has already reviewed the admissibility question and is satisfied. He leaned against the doorframe. Pruitt's name is on the research data alterations. Wade's interest is established through the financial structure and the emails. What the voice memo adds is, he chose his word carefully, directness. Wade's assistant, on behalf of Wade, tells Pruitt explicitly that the data needs to be adjusted to reflect the expected outcomes before the quarterly sponsor report. The break room was very quiet. That's not ambiguous, Mara said. No, Osley agreed. It's not. Felicia had set down her mug and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone processing a significant reframe of an institution they'd worked in for years. What happens to Wade now? Mara asked. He's been informed in the last 30 minutes of the scope of evidence we have. His lawyers are recalibrating their approach. Osley's expression was professionally neutral, but something underneath it was not. He's going to be asked to surrender his board position tonight. Criminal referral to the DOJ is being prepared. He looked at Mara. This will take time. Months, likely. The legal process is not fast, but the direction is no longer in question. She nodded. She understood that distinction. The outcome determined, the path to it long and procedurally grinding. She'd been in situations before where the right thing had been established, and then you had to wait for the machinery to confirm it. The waiting was its own kind of hard. There's one more thing, Osley said. He came into the break room properly and sat down in the third chair. He looked at her with something that was more direct than his professional standard. The information leak. Someone in the investigative loop tonight told Wade that Solano was here and conscious. Mara had not forgotten that. She'd filed it and kept moving, and it had been sitting in the back of her mind all evening. We've identified the source, Osley said. It was a hospital administrator named Karen Vett. She's in a coordinator role that gave her access to patient intake logs. She's been on Wade's payroll through a consulting arrangement that was not disclosed to the hospital. How long? 3 years. Felicia made a sound that was not quite a word. She's been placed on administrative leave, Osley said. Her access has been terminated. She's been notified that she's being referred for investigation. He paused. It also means that Wade knew, when he arrived tonight, that Solano had spoken. He came here to attempt to contain the damage from her account. He brought lawyers and a PR coordinator because he was trying to get in front of the story. Osley looked at Mara steadily. What he didn't know was the voice memo. Mara thought about Wade sitting in the consultation room right now with his lawyers, understanding for the first time the full scope of what had been assembled against him. The documentation, the footage, Solano's account, the emails, and then the voice memo. The voice memo that had been sitting on a phone in a frightened woman's apartment for 6 weeks while she'd tried to figure out if there was a version of this that didn't cost her everything. There wasn't a version that didn't cost anything. Mara had known that from the beginning, but there was a version where the cost was distributed more fairly. Is Harmon still in the building? She asked. He left an hour ago, Osley said. He asked me to tell you, when I saw you, that he'll be in contact tomorrow. He has some things to discuss with you that aren't part of the compliance review. He paused. I don't know the specifics, but he used the word opportunity, which, in my experience with General Harmon, means something he's already decided is going to happen. Mara looked at the table. I just want to sleep, she said. I know, Osley said. You should go. We have everything we need from you tonight. He stood up. At the door, he turned back. Miss Weston, for what it's worth, the thing you did today, in that ER, the triage, the assessment, the specific choices you made under pressure. He paused. I've written a lot of compliance reports. I've sat in a lot of rooms where people failed to do the obvious right thing. I don't usually get to write the other kind. He held her gaze. I'm going to enjoy writing this one. He left. Mara sat with Felicia in the break room for another few minutes, not talking, just sitting, in the particular companionship of two people who had been through the same long day from different angles and were now on the other side of it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Oregon area code. Not Okafor's. She had his now. Not the hospital's system. Something else. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, measured, older. It was not a voice she recognized, but the first thing he said told her immediately and precisely that this call was not happening by accident and had not originated from anyone in the building behind her. Ms. Weston, the voice said, my name is not something I'm going to give you on a phone, but I want you to know that the clinical trial in question involves more than one hospital. Harrowgate is the site you know about. A pause, deliberate, waited. There are 4 others. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. The data from all 5 sites, the voice continued, has been consolidated by the same sponsor, and the alterations at the other 4 facilities were made by people who don't know. An investigation has started. Another pause. You have until the morning before the quarterly sponsor report is filed. If that report goes through with the altered data, the window to unwind it closes. The trial results become a matter of public pharmaceutical record. The break room was very quiet.
"Who are you?" Mara said.
"Someone who tried to stop this 2 years ago through the right channels," the voice said, and discovered that the right channels had already been compromised. A beat. "There's a file," the voice said. "It was supposed to reach the IRB in 2022. It didn't get there. I know where it is now." A pause. "I also know that Jeffrey Wade is not the top of this. He's the middle." The line went dead. Mara sat with the dead phone in her hand for 3 seconds. Then she stood up. Felicia watched her. "What was that?" "I need Osley." Mara was already moving to the door. "Right now." She found him in the corridor outside the administrative wing, still on his own phone, and she waited the 4 seconds it took him to finish his call and then told him everything. The voice, the exact words, the 4 other trial sites, the quarterly report, the 2022 file that hadn't reached the IRB. She told it in sequence, cleanly, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to report in the field when the situation required the other person to receive information without friction. Osley listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 2 seconds. "The morning," he said. That's what he said. Osley looked at his watch. It was 1:07 a.m. The quarterly sponsor report files at 8 a.m. Eastern. That's 6 hours from now. He was already dialing. If the consolidated data goes into the public pharmaceutical record before we can flag the irregularities, unwinding it becomes a multi-year legal process. The trial results get used by the sponsor in investor communications, in FDA submissions, potentially in prescribing recommendations. "I understand the stakes," Mara said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put the phone to his ear and walked away fast, already talking. Mara stood in the corridor. Her headache was still there. Her hip was still there. The granola bars she'd eaten were doing approximately nothing. It was past 1 in the morning, and she had been awake for 19 hours, and the day had just expanded again. She thought about going home. She held the thought for a genuine moment. The apartment, the drafty windows, the radiator, sleep. Then she thought about 47 active trial patients, about 4 other hospitals, 4 other sets of staff who didn't know yet, 4 other sets of patient records that might already be compromised, about a voice on a phone that had said Wade was the middle, not the top. She went to find Harmon's aide. The aide's name was Captain Della Marsh, and she had been awake as long as anyone in the building, and she received Mara's account with the efficient attention of someone trained to process urgent information without letting urgency degrade the processing. "The general needs to know about this tonight," Mara said. "He does," Marsh agreed. She already had her phone out. "Do you have the incoming number?" Mara pulled it up and read it off. Marsh photographed the screen. "Our signals team can work with this. Probably not enough to identify the caller before morning, but enough to confirm the call originated from a legitimate source rather than a spoofed line." "He knew things about the investigation that weren't public," Mara said. "He knew Solano was here. He knew the timeline for the report, which means he's either inside the pharmaceutical company or inside the regulatory structure." Marsh looked at her. "Either way, he's a whistleblower who's been sitting on information for 2 years and chose tonight to use it. The question is, why tonight?" Mara had been thinking about that, because until tonight, there was nothing in motion to attach it to. The investigation gave him a vehicle. Marsh nodded slowly. "Go home," she said. "I mean that practically, not dismissively. You've given us what we need. The next 6 hours are going to involve people with specific federal authority doing things that require that authority. Your part of this for tonight is done." "And the file he mentioned?" "We're working it." Marsh held her gaze. "Ms. Weston, you identified 17 patients today and contributed to outcomes that will be in 3 separate clinical reports. You've given federal investigators a documented record that will be central to at least 2 major referrals, and you just handed us a lead that could expand this investigation significantly." A pause. "Go sleep. You've done enough for one day." It was said without flattery, practically as a logistical assessment. Mara found she could receive it on those terms. She went home. She slept 4 hours. Not well. The kind of sleep that sits close to the surface and leaves you with fragments when you come out of it. But 4 hours was 4 hours. She was up at 6:15 a.m. With coffee, she actually tasted this time, sitting at her kitchen table in the early gray of a December morning when Osley called. "The quarterly report didn't file," he said. At 5:40 a.m. Eastern, the FDA received an emergency notification from our office flagging the trial data under research integrity protocols. The filing window has been suspended pending audit. A pause. All 5 sites. Mara let out a slow breath. The other hospitals, do they know? Their IRBs were contacted at 5 a.m. Eastern. The trial is suspended system-wide. Each site's administration is being briefed this morning. He paused. The sponsor company's legal team has already been in contact with DOJ. Their CEO released a statement 40 minutes ago saying they take research integrity seriously and are cooperating fully, which is what companies say when they've decided that cooperation is cheaper than resistance. She knew what that meant. The company's lawyers had looked at the evidence and made a calculation, which was not justice exactly, but it was the mechanism by which justice sometimes arrived. Wade, she asked, surrendered his board position at 3 a.m. His lawyers negotiated the terms of his cooperation with DOJ overnight. He's not walking away from this, Bob. There are too many documented transactions, but he'll likely spend the next 18 months trying to reduce his exposure. Osley's voice was even. The person above him. We identified them. The call you received last night gave us enough to confirm what the financial trail had been pointing to for hours. It's the chairman of the trial sponsor's parent company. He's based in Seattle. He's being contacted by federal agents this morning. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went past on the street below. Ordinary morning sounds, the world doing its ordinary thing, while in boardrooms and law offices and federal field offices, the machinery was grinding forward. Pruitt? Mara asked. Placed on administrative leave last night. Criminal referral prepared. A pause. Voss? His termination was formally processed at midnight by Dr. Rourke. The grounds include the cafeteria incident, the ER interference, the documented hostile work environment, and his role as a knowing enabler of the research fraud. He's been notified that civil action may follow. Osley let that settle. The 2 staff members who resigned, the hospital's legal team made contact with both of them this morning. Harrowgate is offering remediation discussions. Mara thought about those 2 people. Whoever they were, wherever they'd landed after being pushed out of the building. She thought about Solano, who was still in a hospital bed on the 2nd floor of the building she'd been afraid to return to. "How is Brianna Solano?" she asked. "Medically stable. Her lawyer was with her until 2 a.m. She's being discharged later today." A pause, and something shifted in Osley's professional tone. Not much, but enough. "She asked if you'd be in the building." Mara looked at her coffee. "Tell her yes." She arrived at Harrowgate at 9 a.m. The building looked like itself. The same entrance, the same security desk, the same institutional lobby light. But the texture of the place had changed in a way she felt more than saw. The way a room feels different after the furniture has been rearranged even before you've consciously clocked what moved. Terrence Okafor was in the lobby. He had apparently come in at 7 a.m. for reasons he didn't explain, which she suspected was his way of not quite being willing to be away from the building while things were still resolving. He was in civilian clothes, not his facility's uniform, and he had a coffee he handed to her without comment. "Voss cleaned out his office at 2 a.m., he said. Security supervised it. He didn't say anything on the way out." "Did you expect him to?" "No." He paused. "I've worked in this building for 11 years. I've watched that man walk through it like he owned it for 6 of them." He looked at the lobby floor, then back up. "It's strange when something finally happens. You spend so long waiting for it, and then it does, and it's just a man carrying a box to his car at 2 in the morning. Mara understood that. The resolution of things you've braced against for a long time is almost never proportionate to the bracing. The drama is in the anticipation. The actual event is usually just a man with a box. Dr. Rourke found her 20 minutes later in the corridor outside the elevator. "I need to talk to you about something," Rourke said. And I want to do it before General Harmon arrives because I want you to hear it from me without anyone else's context around it. Mara waited. Rourke looked like someone who had slept 3 hours and had made peace with that. The board met at 7 a.m. emergency session, minus Wade, who is no longer a member. They've authorized a full structural review of administrative practices, reporting chains, and HR protocol. She paused. They've also authorized a new position, Director of Patient Safety and Emergency Preparedness, reporting directly to the CMO's office, which is me, with authority over triage protocol, emergency response standards, and staff safety reporting. She held Mara's gaze. I want to offer it to you. Mara looked at her. I'm aware, Rourke continued, that I don't have a strong foundation to make that offer from, given what this institution allowed to happen to you. I'm also aware that you told me last night you'd think about returning to active nursing status, which was not the enthusiastic yes I'd hoped for. She didn't look away. I'm not asking you to forgive this place. I'm asking you to consider whether you want to be part of changing it. It was an honest ask. Mara gave it the honest consideration it deserved. The thing about Harrowgate, the thing she'd been trying to articulate to herself since last night and hadn't quite reached, was that it was not uniquely broken. It had the specific rot of a place that had been left unexamined for too long under the management of people who prioritized their own positions over the institution's purpose. That happened in hospitals. It happened everywhere that authority went unchecked. Harrowgate was not the worst version of this problem, and it was not the only version, and the people who had been harmed by it, Solano, the two who'd resigned, the others on Okafor's list, were not going to be unharmed by her leaving. She thought about the 15-degree camera angle that had caught what Voss thought was a blind spot. About Okafor's folder, assembled quietly over months. About Debbie Holtz and her 11 o'clock antibiotic, and the way she'd held her eyes steady when she'd delivered the suspension memo. There were people in this building who had been doing the right thing in the margins, carefully, with limited protection. They deserved more than margins. I'll need full authority on the reporting chain, Mara said. Not advisory authority. Actual authority. If I flag a safety issue, it cannot be filtered through administrative approval before it reaches your office. Agreed. I want a formal whistleblower protection structure in place before I start. Written, board-approved, legally reviewed. The board already discussed that this morning. It's in the authorization. Rourke paused. What else? Okafor gets a formal role in the facility's safety review. He's been doing that work informally for years without recognition or protection. That changes. Rourke nodded. I'll speak to him today. And Brianna Solano, Mara said. If she wants to come back, whenever she's ready, if she's ever ready, she has a path, no conditions, no probationary framing, no institutional language that makes her feel like she's being managed. Rourke was quiet for a moment. That's not entirely within my legal authority to guarantee given the ongoing investigation, but the intent is noted and I will do everything within my power to make it real. She looked at Mara steadily. Is that a yes? Mara thought about the apartment with the drafty windows, about the 14 months of keeping her head down and her documentation sharp and her reactions measured, and the specific exhaustion of being competent in a building that kept trying to tell her she wasn't. About the cafeteria yesterday morning, a lifetime ago, and the moment after, when she'd stood in the wreckage of her tray and swept the room and found, in the back corner, Okafor's face. Yes, she said. Yet. Harmon arrived at 10:30 a.m. He came without the full contingent this time, just one aide, Captain Marsh, and he moved through the lobby with the same reorganizing presence as the night before, but with something different in it, less operational urgency, something more deliberate. He found Mara in the consultation room, the windowless one, which had become by default the room where everything significant in this building happened, and which now had 2 fresh boxes of tissues on the table, courtesy of someone who had noticed. He sat across from her. Marsh closed the door from outside. The caller last night, Harmon said. We identified him. She waited. His name is Dr. Elliot Frazier. He was the principal investigator on the clinical trial at its originating site, a hospital in Spokane, when it launched in 2020. He raised concerns internally in 2022 about data irregularities and was told the issues had been addressed. He wasn't shown the specifics. When the trial expanded to 4 additional sites, including Harrowgate, he began to suspect the irregularities hadn't been addressed but had simply been moved and distributed. Harmon looked at her. He contacted the IRB in 2022. The contact was received by a coordinator who was, we now know, connected to the same network as Wade. The file was buried. He's been sitting on this for 2 years, Mara said. He's been building a case for 2 years, Harmon corrected. He's been waiting for something that created enough institutional disruption to use it. He paused. He chose last night because of you. The news of what happened at Harrowgate yesterday moved through the regional medical community faster than you might expect. Fraser saw it, saw the federal involvement, and decided the window was open. Mara thought about a man in Spokane, 2 years of careful documentation, watching for the right moment. Is he protected? She asked. He will be. He came in voluntarily to our Spokane field office at 8 a.m. this morning. The file he referenced, the one that should have reached the IRB in 2022, was in his possession. It's now in ours. Harmon's expression was measured. The Seattle chairman is being taken in for questioning as we speak. His legal team is, I'm told, very busy. The shape of the whole thing was visible now, in a way it hadn't been last night. Not just Harrowgate, not just Voss and Wade and Pruitt and the cafeteria and the suspension letter. A structure, multi-site, multi-year, built on the assumption that the people inside it could be managed and the people outside it would never look closely enough. Built on the specific arrogance of people who had confused institutional position with immunity. I want to ask you something, Harmon said. You're going to anyway, she said. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. The commendation from Kunar. You never submitted the documentation for the formal civilian honor equivalency. It was offered twice through the resettlement program. She'd known this was coming eventually. I know. Why not? She thought about how to say it accurately, because I didn't want to carry it around as a credential. It was a thing that happened. People lived. I came home. She paused. Using it as a door opener for every subsequent situation felt like it would make it about me rather than about them. Harmon was quiet for a moment. I understand that, he said. I don't entirely agree with it, but I understand it. He looked at her directly. What happened yesterday in that ER is going to be documented, not as a commendation you carry, as an institutional record that becomes part of how this hospital reforms its emergency protocols. Your name will be in that record. A pause. I wanted you to know that before it happened. Thank you, she said. It was a simple exchange, and it was enough. At 2 p.m., Brianna Solano was discharged. She came down to the main floor with her lawyer and her roommate, a young woman who had the specific exhausted relief of someone who had found the right person in time and had not yet fully metabolized that fact. Solano looked pale and had the slightly underwater quality of someone 40 hours out from a trauma, but she was walking under her own authority and she was looking around the lobby with the clear eyes of someone who had decided something. Mara was at the nurse's station when she came through. Solano saw her and changed direction. They stood in the corridor outside the ER, which was running at normal capacity today. The bus crash 40 hours past, the monitors and the movement, and the ordinary urgent work of a trauma floor proceeding as it had before and would after. I heard you took the director position, Solano said. Word moved fast in hospitals. This morning, Mara confirmed. Solano looked at the ER doors. I'm not ready to come back, she said. Not to this place. Maybe not to any place for a while. She paused. But I want to, eventually. I want to still be a nurse. You will be, Mara said. How do you know? Because you spent 6 weeks being pressured by people with significantly more institutional power than you, and instead of doing what they wanted, you made a voice memo. Mara held her gaze. That's not someone who's done. Solano's jaw moved. She held it together, barely, with the effort visible on her face. I was so scared, she said, the whole time. I kept thinking if I stayed calm enough and professional enough, that it would stop on its own, Mara said. I know. It doesn't, though. No, Mara said. It doesn't. They stood there for a moment in the particular honesty of two people who had learned the same lesson from different angles of the same situation. Not a clean lesson, not the kind that came with a tidy moral attached. The kind that comes from going through something and coming out the other side still standing, still clear-eyed about what it cost. Dr. Rourke's office will be in contact about the remediation process, Mara said. When you're ready. No timeline, no pressure. Solano nodded. She started to turn, then stopped. What you said last night, about staying quiet, not stopping it, just changing the timeline. She looked at Mara. Did you believe that before yesterday, or did you just figure it out? Mara thought about it honestly. Both, she said. I knew it. Yesterday made me sure of it. Solano held that for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned and walked through the lobby with her lawyer and her roommate and out through the main doors into the gray December afternoon. The weeks that followed were not triumphant in the cinematic sense. They were grinding and procedural and full of the specific friction of institutional change happening inside an institution that was still, at the same time, trying to be a hospital. The board's structural review took 3 months. It produced 47 recommendations, 31 of which were adopted in the first round. The remaining 16 referred for a second review that Mara attended every session of and pushed on every item she'd flagged. The whistleblower protection policy was board-approved and legally reviewed and signed into effect on a Tuesday afternoon in February, with none of the ceremony of the moment's significance. Which was fine, because it was a policy, not a celebration, and policies worked by being used, not by being celebrated. Dale Voss did not find another hospital administrator role. The documentation of his conduct, the cafeteria footage, the ER interference record, the 7 staff accounts, his knowing facilitation of the research fraud, was thorough enough that 2 subsequent employers who'd called Harrowgate's HR for references had received information that ended those conversations. He was, as far as Mara knew, in the process of some kind of reinvention that she had no particular need to track. Pruitt was charged under federal research fraud statutes in January. His cooperation with the DOJ in exchange for reduced exposure meant the timeline on the larger prosecution moved faster than it would have otherwise. He named 3 more intermediaries. The net expanded. Jeffrey Wade's trial date was set for the following fall. His lawyers had successfully deferred several proceedings, which was the thing Osley had predicted, the delay mechanism of people with expensive legal teams. But the evidence was substantial enough that deferral was a strategy for reducing consequences, not avoiding them. The outcome, as Osley had said, was no longer in question, only the timeline. The Seattle chairman, whose name was Robert Callister, and who had sat on the boards of 4 pharmaceutical entities and 2 hospital networks, and had insulated himself behind sufficient layers of financial structure that the initial tracing had taken 4 hours, was indicted in March. The indictment ran to 11 counts. It was covered in 3 national publications and extensively in the regional press, including a piece in a Portland paper that described, in general terms, the events at a Delmore hospital that had first exposed the network. The piece did not name Mara. She had declined to be named. Dr. Frazier, the principal investigator from Spokane who had called her from an unknown number at 1 a.m., on a December night received formal whistleblower protection status and cooperated fully with the federal investigation. He was reinstated at his hospital in February. Mara spoke with him once by phone, a brief and practical conversation about the trial's patient notification process, and found him to be exactly what she'd expected from his voice: careful, tired in a long-term way, and quietly relieved. The clinical trials affected patients across all 5 sites, 61 enrolled, 47 active, were notified individually of the data irregularities and offered full reevaluation of their treatment records. Several of them had received care that was unaffected by the altered data. A smaller number required treatment review. For all of them, the process was handled by the IRB in coordination with each hospital's patient advocacy office, which at Harrowgate now fell under Mara's department. She learned in the course of that work that 2 of the affected patients at Harrowgate had been treated in ways that reflected the falsified outcomes rather than the actual ones. Neither case had resulted in serious harm, but both required care adjustments. She sat in on both notification meetings. She did not speak in either one unless spoken to. Her presence was not as a director. It was as a witness to the thing that happened when institutional dishonesty met the actual human cost of it. Two people in chairs, listening to explanations of what had been done to their records, asking questions with the specific, bewildered precision of people trying to understand something that shouldn't have happened. It was not comfortable to sit through. She didn't try to make it comfortable. She stayed. On a Thursday morning in late March, Mara was in her office, a small room on the third floor that had been formerly used for storage and still had marks on the wall where shelves had been removed. Reviewing the new triage protocol she and Dr. Webb had been drafting together for 6 weeks, when there was a knock on the open door. It was a young nurse. She was maybe 24, in her first year at Harrowgate, and she had the specific expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now recalibrating in the actual moment. Her name badge said Lena. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "You're not interrupting," Mara said. Come in." Lena came in. She sat in the chair across the desk. There was only one, which Mara had decided was the right number, and held a folder in her lap with the careful grip of something important. "I wanted to report something," Lena said, formally, using the new reporting structure. "Okay." "There's a physician on the second floor. Not an administrator, a physician. He's been making comments to nursing staff during rounds, nothing like—" She stopped, recalibrating. "Not like what happened before. But the comments are—" She looked at the folder. "I documented 4 instances over 3 weeks, with dates and witnesses." Mara looked at her. She was careful, and she'd prepared, and she was scared in the specific way of someone who had decided to do the right thing and was waiting to find out whether the institution would hold. "Thank you for documenting it," Mara said. "That matters." She reached across the desk. "Can I see?" Lena passed the folder. Mara read it. 4 incidents, clearly recorded, names, dates, the specific language used, the names of staff present. It was thorough. It was exactly what documentation was supposed to look like. "This goes to HR today," Mara said. "Under the new protocol, you'll receive a formal acknowledgement within 48 hours. The review process is 60 days maximum. You'll be informed at every stage." She looked at Lena directly. "And if you experience any kind of response from this physician or from anyone else that feels like retaliation, you contact me directly. My number is on the internal directory, and you can also use the anonymous reporting line." She paused. "Are you okay?" Lena let out a breath she'd clearly been holding. "I didn't know if it was enough to report." "It's enough," Mara said. "It's more than enough. You documented it, and you came in and you sat in that chair. That's what the process needs to work." Lena nodded. She stood up. At the door, she turned. "I heard about what happened in December, what you did in the ER." Mara waited. "I've been thinking about it since I started," Lena said. "About how you were here for a year and a half and nobody knew, and then when it mattered, you just—" She stopped. "How did you stay standing when all of it was happening?" It was the real question under the asked question. Mara recognized it. She thought about the cafeteria, the tray, the spilled coffee, 200 people's eyes. She thought about 14 months of documentation in a laptop folder she'd hoped she'd never need. She thought about a break room at midnight and Felicia's terrible coffee and a phone call from an unknown number and the 43 seconds of security footage that had shown a young woman walking away from something she shouldn't have been made to carry alone. She thought about the Korengal, which she didn't talk about, but which was always there. Not as a wound exactly, not anymore, but as a reference point. A place she'd been that had made her understand permanently the difference between what people could survive and what people thought they couldn't. "I knew something they didn't," she said. Lena waited. "They thought ignoring me made me smaller," Mara said. "It didn't. Every time they dismissed me, every time they looked past me, every time they decided I wasn't worth their attention, that was time I was using to understand exactly how the place worked and exactly where the failures were." She paused. "They thought my silence was weakness. It wasn't. It was inventory." Lena was quiet for a moment. "That's not something they teach you," she said. "No," Mara agreed. You mostly learn it the hard way. After Lena left, Mara sat in her office with the triage protocol draft and the folder and the thin winter light coming through the one window, which had a view of the parking structure but also, at the right angle, a slice of actual sky. She thought about what she'd said to Lena and whether it was true, and decided that it was, but not completely. Because the other part of it, the part she hadn't said, was that there had been moments in those 14 months when she hadn't been certain. When the documentation felt like an act of stubborn refusal to accept the obvious conclusion, which was that she should leave and go somewhere that wanted her. When the cost of staying had seemed disproportionate to any realistic outcome, she had stayed anyway, not because she'd known how it would end, not because she'd had a strategy, partly because of the patience, which was true, partly because she was stubborn, which was also true, and partly because somewhere in the accumulated weight of her particular history, she had learned that the people who were most certain you would leave were often the ones with the most to lose if you didn't. You couldn't always outlast them. She knew that too. Some fights went the other way, and the people who documented carefully and stayed steady still lost, and that was real, and it happened, and the world had not yet arranged itself into a place where the rightness of a position guaranteed its outcome. But sometimes you stayed, and the camera was 15 degrees off from what they'd calculated, and the woman they'd pressured had made a voice memo, and the man who'd been sitting on a file for 2 years was watching for a window. And all of it converged on a Wednesday in December when 3 government vehicles pulled into the ambulance bay and a general walked through a lobby looking for someone specific. Sometimes the truth arrived. You just had to still be in the building when it did. Her phone buzzed. Osley. A text. Callister indictment unsealed this morning. 11 counts. Wanted you to see it first. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone down and picked up the triage protocol draft and turned to the section she'd been working on, the part about identifying high-risk patients and intake conditions when staff resources were constrained, and kept writing. There was a lot left to build. The whistleblower policy was in place, but culture didn't change by policy alone. It changed by the 100 small decisions made every day by people who decided that speaking up was worth the risk, and that decision required the place they were speaking up in to actually hold. That was the work. Not the dramatic day in December, not the footage and the investigation and the indictments. This, a 24-year-old nurse sitting down in a chair with a folder and trusting the process to work. Making the process worthy of that trust. That was the job now. She kept writing until the light shifted and the parking structure outside her window went from gray to the particular pale gold of an Oregon winter afternoon, and the hospital around her did what hospitals do. Kept running, kept caring, kept making its ordinary and extraordinary demands on the people inside it who had decided this was where they were supposed to be. She had decided. She stayed.